walks in, we'll welcome them. I'm Janet Michelson-Variahu. I am the head of the programming committee. I think they call it now the events committee for the board of Bala Cynwyd Library. And so I arrange evening programs, always interested in knowing new speakers. If anybody has any great ideas or has something to say to a group, we're always interested. We're thrilled today to have a neighbor of ours, Jim Zervanos. We always like local authors and to spotlight their books. He's the author of the novel Love Park, and he's had award-winning short stories and essays published. He is a graduate of Bucknell University, where he won prizes in writing and also was an All-American baseball player, very exciting, and he's now coaching in Little League, which is very exciting, and teaching. And I'm curious to hear about, he completed the narrative medicine workshop at Columbia University, which probably helped him in writing this book, That Time I Got Cancer. So, Jim Zervanos.
Thank you so much for coming, everybody.
One
Yes.
thing quickly, I want to make sure everybody knows here that we are recording, so if you have any concerns, because we do like to post it on our website for those that couldn't actually join us tonight. So just a little heads up. It's back behind you, so none of your faces are really being seen. So don't worry, okay?
So thanks again for coming. It's a thrill to be here, especially because it's my neighborhood library. And thanks for supporting the wonderful Narberth bookstore. There are books here, and I'm happy to chat with you afterward and sign books if you'd like. And I'll talk for a half an hour and mix in a short reading or two along the way. And my story all begins on this date, August 16th, 2011. It was a beautiful summer day, and as a high school English teacher with summers off, I was enjoying my time, as I was all summer, walking my one-year-old son Nikitas around the art museum area where we lived at the time. My plan was to go to a Phillies game in a matter of hours, and so the day was really turning out to be rather idyllic. We would pause here at our favorite fountain, which was just a couple of blocks away from home. Within the hour, I was getting dressed to go to the Phillies game, and when I say all of a sudden, it's always an understatement. I haven't quite found the right phrasing yet. It's especially an understatement because I saw what was happening to me before I felt what was happening to me, because I was in my bedroom and I saw in the mirror my head and neck swelling up. I assumed, I think it ended up correctly, my head and neck swelling up with backed up blood, and my neck and head were turning purple. I kind of knew intuitively that I didn't have enough time even to call 911, that at the rate that this was happening, I didn't expect to be around for much longer. I called out to my wife, who came running up the stairs, and she stood there by my side, the two of us completely alarmed. I called my dad, who's a doctor, and I described what was happening to him, and he just said, breathe, just breathe. And several minutes passed. And fortunately, as alarming as this was, at some point it sort of plateaued, and it didn't get worse, but it just kind of peaked. But it lasted 2 or 3 minutes, which felt like an eternity. And after a time, it kind of receded. The later clinical explanations that I would get was that, as my surgeon would put it later, it's like pipe physics. Whatever was in there hit a certain point. It had been growing, but then there was that tipping point and everything just kind of backed up. But then, it found its equilibrium, and your body, continued to have its normal blood flow. I was ready to go to the Phillies game because within minutes I felt normal again, and I guess it was partly denial. And my dad said, no, you're going to the ER now. And so I proceeded to do that, where I got x-rays and various exams and waited in my room for several hours and watched the Phillies game on TV. I watched Roy Halladay lose a lead in the 9th, which may have been fortuitous, I don't know. Around midnight, I went out to the front desk and asked the attending ER doc if she was as surprised as I was that we still hadn't gotten results back on what I assumed was simple x-rays. And she said, I'll be in and talk to you in a minute. I think I understood that it didn't take this long to get x-ray results back, that people were in back rooms talking. Nonetheless, nothing could have prepared me for her very brief visit. Sweet and tender, but she had other duties out there. But she came in and sat next to me and showed me this fuzzy gray x-ray. And even to my amateur eyes, it was clear that something was drastically wrong with that image. And she said that what we were looking at was my superior vena cava, the vein that goes, the main vein that enters the heart from above. And she pointed to what was an hourglass shape and said, these words, this could be fatal. We just don't know what this is. And she spent a minute with me and went back to her duties. I spent the next 4 days that I was admitted. I was told that they were assembling the best possible team. I was assigned a great surgeon, Dr. Wu, who was a vascular surgeon. He seemed the appropriate guy to sort of, captain the ship. I had every expert from every department imaginable. Side note, ironically, everything except for oncology, because the one thing they were sure it wasn't was cancer, because lymphoma just does not present this way, let alone other cancers that you could speculate it being. After 4 days, Dr. Wu came and saw me and said, we can't just keep you here forever. We don't know what it is, but the body is a mysterious thing. And now and then there's just an idiopathic condition that we don't need to explain. And so we're going to send you home. And if the symptoms present in the same dramatic way that they had before, obviously come back. I didn't need that instruction. I had been told that he's never seen this before. None of us have, and this message had been reiterated to me over and over again for those 4 days. So I left, needless to say, with great caution, in spite of the optimistic pat on the back. But I went with it. Dr. Scott Teratola was on my case from beginning to end. And we'll hear from him in a moment. But he's the interventional radiologist. And the only way that you can treat whatever it is that might have been ailing me is to get a biopsy. They could see that it was in the vein, but the details of that were hard to grasp. In any case, what he would have to do, and the way that he put it rather dramatically and making the point, was that even if I had your superior vena cava, that vein in my hand, and I had my needle, I would not dare to try to extract some piece of it. Let's see if this works.
So I never in my life collapsed.
I'll repeat.
Still on biopsy, intravascular masses. They're always crowded in one way or the other. There's always some piece that you say, okay, I can go after that safely. This thing is just hourglass, there were some devices that aren't on the market anymore that could see if we were used to shade a little bit of it. Probably with that diagnosis, the only that vein wall. The only way to get to that lymphoma is to get through the vein wall and get into the peritoneous tissue around the vein. And then create a hole in the vein,
If you couldn't hear a word, the body language probably says it all. Hourglass, the only way to get a piece of that thing was with the needle through the vein wall, and then you've made a hole in the vein, and he didn't want to do that. And his earlier words was, never seen anything like this before. And it was just so perfectly cylindrical. And typically cancer and malignant tumors are ugly in shape and not symmetrical, etc. So among the various reasons that they had counted that out as a possible diagnosis. So I was sent on my way. I was looking forward to school. I had my fingers crossed that this could actually be idiopathic and this was some condition that I might just live with. I could certainly be grateful for that, but I was skeptical because I still had those symptoms, even though they weren't, as dramatic as they were at that, in that early moment. So I went to the beach with my wife and my 1-year-old child and my parents, but I was constantly assessing those veins on my neck because they were bulging still, and my neck was swollen in general, and I just felt uncomfortable when I would bend over. Anything that any normal person would get, you know, head rush, I was getting it, but exponentially, and it was just getting worse. So at the same time, I just felt so grateful to be alive. You know, those words were harrowing and still lingering in my head. This could be fatal. We just don't know what this is. And I left, and that really hadn't changed. And until I had any good reason to think otherwise, you know, I wasn't dwelling on it, trying not to, but that's where my mind was. And it increased my sense of awareness of being present with my child. And I was just grateful to be alive still, even while that fear was just as great and equally great. Labor Day weekend rolled around, and there was just no denying that my symptoms were getting worse. And I kind of showed up at the doorway in my townhouse in the city. My parents happened to be there, and my wife, and I had my bag packed, and I said, it's time to go back. And turns out that Labor Day weekend was when all the doctors were on vacation. At least all the guys who were on my team, you know, my team of experts, you know, so many ways that I can compliment their attentiveness to me. But among them are this story of their receiving my phone calls at the beach, communicating with each other, you know, hearing that I was back, and making a plan for me. And the plan was Tuesday morning, we're going to do a venogram so we can finally get, you know, the best possible imaging of what's going on inside there. Because there were all sorts of different doctors while they were gone coming up with theories, and it was feeling like we were going backwards, and they kind of laid down the plan and said, this is what's up. So Tuesday morning, I was going to get a venogram. This is the venogram from that Tuesday morning after Labor Day weekend. And just to kind of emphasize what we should be seeing here in the book, I describe it as a hot dog that should just be one long hot dog. Instead, right there at the top part of that bottom part of the hot dog is it's like there's this toothpick stuck on top where the other two, the brachiocephalic veins, branch off from that toothpick. But that toothpick should be as wide as the hot dog. And what we're seeing is, you know, the ink in the blood so that it lights up. And so that narrow spot there, that's like the toothpick in the hot dog, is the narrow space where the blood is making its way to my heart. And that thing was closing in, you know, it was down to like 5 or fewer centimeters, whereas the rest of the superior vena cava was 15 millimeters. Or excuse me, I said, we were down to 5 or so millimeters, and the whole thing should be 15 millimeters. Nobody knew what to do. Dr. Teratola got a whole lot of pressure on him. Look, we've got nothing left that we can do. You got to go in there and try and get a piece so we can do a biopsy. And he said, I'm not going to kill the guy if I do that. So he refused. Later, he would tell me that if he weren't the veteran doctor that he was, and he were a younger doctor with that same pressure himself, looking back 20 years earlier, he said, I don't know if I would have been able to stand the pressure, especially when everybody's saying, like, we've got no other cards to play. So within hours after this venogram was taken, Dr. Wu came in to visit me, and he said, we've talked about a surgical solution and we don't have one. We've talked about doing that biopsy, and Dr. Teratola refuses. There's nothing left that we can do. And I was left there with my parents and my wife. They were naturally alarmed and sad. Obviously, I was less alarmed, equally devastated, but weirdly prepared for the moment, as I had been thinking about this for the last 2+ weeks since there was that first night in the ER. In the hour that followed, I had sort of casually, almost hypothetically, said to the attending doctor how great it would be if I could just go downstairs to the basement and sit with Dr. Miller, the chest radiologist guy, and see all the different images that I've been hearing about since the first night I was here. Because I had all, you know, I was trying to figure out like what is really going on inside there. If only to sort of see the future cause of my death, you know, which is kind of what it was. Needless to say, it was a sad day. Dr. Pocatino's name was mentioned when I was in that basement looking at those images, because the woman had returned and said, I talked to Dr. Miller. He said, you can come down and look with him. And so he had these amazing screens that were three-dimensional. And we were like doing a roller coaster ride through my vein down into this narrow space. And Dr. Teratola was standing there, and the two of them looked at each other and just said, this might have to be a case for Dr. Pocatino. And I looked at them and said, who's this Dr. Pocatino? Turns out he's a heart and lung transplant surgeon. And when he first came in about 6 hours later, I was told not to expect him because he's a busy man, maybe tomorrow if you're lucky. But he showed up that evening. And we chuckled because I didn't need a heart or lung transplant. And he explained to me that he'd been using this material called core matrix, which is made out of pig intestine, an organic material. And he said, what I propose is that I go in there and I just take out your entire superior vena cava and that affected area. And instead of using that material as a patch, I'm going to roll it up and make a graft and make a fake vein and attach it in there and hope it works. I was shocked. My parents were shocked. We were relieved and excited. They were skeptical. I hugged him and said, we're on. How long do we have to wait? He said, Friday at the latest. I said, let's do it Friday, so that I had 3 days to be around with my family and friends. And then we went into surgery on that Friday, and I came out on the other side. And when he came to visit me afterward, it turns out that it was much more complicated than he had expected, because up there at that toothpick area where it turns into a Y and goes into those other two veins, he said, it turns out the black muck that he called it, which would turn out to be cancer, went up into that Y. So on the fly, he had to take that cylinder that he was planning to use as the graft and take some more material and make a Y and take off some of those other two veins. And he pulled this miraculous surgery off. The most shocking thing, though, was that 5 days later, and even after the surgery, he said, I've never seen anything like it, but I'm still assuming it's benign because it didn't look like cancer, and he's seen cancer, right? So it wasn't what he knew cancer looked like. And by his logic and everyone else's logic, therefore it's something else, but it's not that. Well, it turned out that that's what it was. And you just saw doctor's eyes roll back in surprise. The next conversation to be had was, well, now this guy's got this pig intestine graft in his chest that needs 3 months to heal. And the oncologist now was coming on to the team, and he said, we're not waiting 3 months for you to be treated with chemotherapy. And so they had to compromise. And the deal was that in 1 month, we're going to start you on chemotherapy. They even called the core matrix company to find out how does chemotherapy, how does this core matrix material respond to chemotherapy? And they said, you got us. We have no such precedent. So yet another kind of unprecedented circumstance. Well, we started the chemo and all was going well. This was Dr. Pocatino's line before he exited the room that night when he told me the surgical plan. And I started the healing process. And chemo was underway. When I got the diagnosis, my buddy John was right there next to me in the room. And he said, courage, man, you've already been through the hardest part. And I think I'm one of the rare cases of getting a cancer diagnosis and thinking, yeah, you're probably right. You know, cancer seemed almost secondary or whatever I was about to go through, having gone through what I had just gone through. And I was kind of prepared for, you know, the process. I even had kind of happy doctors come and visit me, and I was alarmed by their reaction to the diagnosis. And I thought, what are you so happy about? And they said, well, now we know what it is, we can treat you. And it turns out that the diagnosis of large B-cell lymphoma would respond well to chemotherapy. And fortunately for me, you know, that is what happened. The drama that ensued was how this graft was going to respond to chemotherapy. And I think that went well also. The twist is, ironically, that as that graft was healing at the surgical spot, it kept on healing and shrinking and scarring and narrowing, and it ended up causing my symptoms to return. And so I was back to being scanned. And when we saw that hourglass again, it was almost more terrifying than anything that had happened yet, because the solution would be to stent it. And Dr. Teratola, who didn't want to touch me in the first place, certainly didn't want to go putting a stent into this now pig intestine graft that was also enduring chemotherapy. And so we had some real heart-to-heart conversations where he said, this thing needs time to heal. And the last thing in the world I want to do is go sticking a stent down in there to create, width for your blood flow to get through there. So we want to hold off, but I gotta beg you not to try to be a hero. And let me know if it gets really uncomfortable, but we're all taking the messages from you, that you're teaching us through this whole thing. This is Dr. Schuster, my oncologist.
Now is here, I tell you, I've practiced medicine for over 40 years. I know I don't know, but over 40 years. And I've never seen a case like yours of intravascular lymphoma presenting in a large vessel as a unifocal area or region of involvement. In general, there's more than one vascular event that's done, or that is involved by lymphoma when you see intravascular lymphoma. And actually, most cases of intravascular lymphoma are diagnosed at autopsy.
So it's not that it never appears, it's just that they never discover it until it's too late. But I guess it's still so rare that it's not part of the working, outlook when they're trying to figure these things out. So the chemotherapy continues, and that shrinking continues, and there was much suspense and drama, but it really caused me to be present in my life and to be aware of every second and grateful. And I really got into meditation. I had a psychiatrist talk about having somebody from virtually every field at the hospital come and visiting me and sort of talking me through these rather anxious times. I started to not look quite like myself. And at some point, I was home and I had been through a few rounds of chemotherapy and I just needed to get out of the house. I had finally healed enough from the surgery that I felt that I was able to do that. And I thought I'd read this scene of the first night that I left my house. And it wasn't anything exciting, but it seemed appropriate that the first thing that I should do would be to go to a reading. And since we're at a reading, this was me on the other side of that experience. And it was a night out at Bryn Mawr College. The first venture into the world was to attend a literary event at Bryn Mawr College, where my friend Robin was on a panel with 4 other writers discussing the short story. Robin's husband, Richard, drove all the way from the suburbs to pick me up. When I opened the door to the minivan, he smiled and said, "Hey, Cancer Boy." I was stunned, then weirdly thrilled, this nickname suggesting youth and, better yet, survival. I grinned, trusting Richard's intuition. Cancer Boy. It was the twisted name of a superhero, or the superhero's sidekick. I was weak-boned, pale-skinned, and puffed up, cocooned in black alpaca hair coat and ski cap snug atop my thinning hair. As we drove from the bright city into the dark suburban landscape, I wondered at my new identity. This was the beginning of a metamorphosis. I watched from the shadows, biding my time, grateful to be the passenger. In the back of an old cathedral, we sat under stained glass windows and colossal beams. Robin and the 3 other writers were on stage behind a long table in the far distance, beyond rows of heads. I was there and somehow also not there, floating at the edges of a community of writers I had over the years come to belong to. Tonight, I was privately rooting for all of them. The thrill I felt for the magnificent power of words and stories, undiluted by my own ambitions. Their faces glowed under spotlights. Karen Russell, Chris Adrian, Rivka Galchin, whose stories I had read with awe. These 3 alongside my friend Robin Black, whose modest brilliance shone brightest in my eyes. I was pleased to relinquish the creative responsibilities to them entirely. They would do what work needed to be done. It was a relief to be off the hook, to be a witness to the relevant and vital activities of the living. I did not yet recognize that my own work had become an unconscious process of collecting scraps I might one day use in the story I would have to tell. After the presentation, while the authors signed books and others mingled, I stood against a wall, feeling ghostly despite my dark coat and olive green cap. Dan Torde, the program director, glanced my way and didn't seem to recognize me. Then he smiled warmly and approached. He said he'd been getting reports from Robin. He invited me to join him and the visiting authors at the local pub. I had never turned down his past invitations, and tonight, more than ever, I wanted to drink a beer and chat idly about books, or just to inhabit the same space for a while longer. With these writers whose intelligence and creativity seemed to project outward from them, materializing in blue-green tattoos on the arms of Chris Adrian, oozing in the dark tendrils from the head of Rivka Galchin, who right now, behind a nearby table stacked with paperbacks, was telling a curious woman what it was like to be both a doctor and an author. Later, walking across the quad toward the parking lot, I told Chris that for years I'd been teaching his story Every Night for 1,000 Years, which features Walt Whitman, our great poet, the selfless lover, nursing soldiers back to health during the Civil War. Chris reminded me that he was also a pediatric oncologist, and I thought, who are these magnificent beings in my midst, master practitioners of medicine and fiction? I was a master practitioner of a different sort, I wanted to tell them, with insights to share from the other side. But my energy was dwindling, and Richard's minivan was waiting. I was strangely at ease watching them all disappear into the night, pleased that our lives had intersected for this brief moment. Mine was, I realized, the thinking of an old man, pleased with the time he'd had here, content with the prospects of finality. These were not morbid thoughts, but those of sweet sorrow. While I no longer expected to die soon, I'd been left feeling the chill of the imminence of death for all of us. My God, go, all of you, brilliant souls, and make beautiful things. It is only that I may beat you to it is all. So that's the beginning of that chapter in the book. There was never a dull moment. By the 6th round of my chemo, I got neutropenic, which means that you've lost all your white blood cells, or at least the infection-fighting blood cells, and I ended up in the hospital, fearing that I might get septic with all of the complications and even potential death that might follow. But I got through that, and once I got through that, there really was the feeling I had the nerve to feel confident that maybe this is it after all. And I got to the other side of chemo. I couldn't wait to get back to school. By now, we're talking end of February into March. There was one marking period left in the entire school year. And when I showed up at school, my colleagues thought I was completely nuts. Why don't you just take the rest of the year off and come back in September? But I wanted to get back into the action and not feel like I had lost the whole year. But really, I just wanted to get back and be in an environment that I loved and be among the kids and talking literature and be with my colleagues. This is my classroom at Pencrest where I teach in at the high school in media. I was able to start exercising and walking. And those scans still showed that narrow, and I still felt that intense backing up feeling. So come August, I went to visit Dr. Teratola, who a year before in August wouldn't dare put a needle into my vein lest he puncture that vein and there's catastrophic bleeding. And then who resisted putting a stent in me when it started narrowing while I was in the midst of chemo. And now I was going to see him to ask if I could do angioplasty because other doctors, including my surgeon, was looking at that narrowing and saying, you can't live like this forever. I was on blood thinners, et cetera. So Dr. Teratola and I looked at another image, and the two of us sat there and looked at that thing, and I said, how the heck is any blood getting through there? I don't understand. And he looked at it and shook his head and said, I don't understand it either. And I don't have to, but I am not going in there and opening that thing up with a balloon because, you know, you look great and you're walking and you don't have to run and you don't have to lift weights. You're alive and you're well. At this point, a year had passed. I had learned all the way, back in the previous, August, that the hope was that collateral veins would form, that pressure would recede and the veins would fall, they would find other pathways to the heart, that I didn't need that 15-millimeter opening. But they were expecting to see veins on my chest wall, and that just never happened. They could never see collateral veins, even in the scans within, my body. And so even that remained a total enigma. But that was his line. Let's not try to fix what's not broken. And so we shook hands and I left. And I just kept walking and I could do 10 push-ups and that was enough. And I just didn't bother with such stuff. But 6 months later, I got so bored from walking. I thought, I'm walking so fast. I had all this energy. I wanted to get back to normal. I was ready to join the Olympics as a walker. And I just started running, and I would do 10 steps, and then that pressure would back up and I'd get frustrated and stop. It was a real test of my patience, but I also kept pushing it. I had been told that, that you've plateaued and you shouldn't expect it to get any better. And I wasn't trying to defy that. I was just trying to defy my boredom from doing nothing but walking. And so I kept pushing it. And within a year, I had managed to get to about a mile of a slow jog. And within 2 years, I was jogging sort of full speed in 2-3 miles. And to this day, I've just continued to evolve. I don't think it's really a factor. I can jog 5-6 miles, which is as much as I've ever been able to jog. So it has nothing to do with my venous system. And I think I've kind of just maxed out at that capacity. So that was a pleasant surprise. I still can't lift weights or do more than 10 push-ups. There are things even bending over to tie my shoes, and I get backed up, and I still take those blood thinners to keep the blood flowing.
For not doing something, students have 4 generations of students about to do it, and how I'm so happy that you treated me. At time, Jim, let's face it, there was a time there was a lot of pressure on me. And unfortunately, I was a senior person, able to sort of stand around and say, no, it's not right to do. Don't tell us what it's time.
So he says, I'm the poster boy for restraint in the practice of medicine. In another clip that I have him, he says, what you experienced, and he was speaking from his own experience too. He took great pride in it, that your case is a case of like the very best in the practice, the art of medicine. You had all these different doctors and so many different people that played their role. And his role, ironically, was, restraint, to exercise that, to let the body sort of do its work. And thank God he didn't intervene when he had such great pressure to do that. In the last chapter, there's an epilogue that follows, but it's a year later. And these are just the last 2 paragraphs of the book where I'm nostalgic from the year. I'm back at the beach. The appropriate thing to do on the 16th of the following year was to take my kid to a Phillies game. That seemed like the right thing, but they were out of town. So we did the next best thing and went to the beach with my parents. I had managed to get past tearing up at every marvelous moment, at every bit of meaningless beauty, though I remained as aware as I could be of the miraculous reality of this life, of the breath that sustained me, of my ever-pumping heart, fast or slow, of my cooperative body with all of its confounding mysteries that scans couldn't explain. As Nikita slept, my dad read at the kitchen table, my mom paged through a magazine in the living room, Vana headed to the post office, and I sat by the window with my laptop, considering what work there was to accomplish. I wondered if or when I would ever write about this experience I'd been through. Too soon, I decided. Writing about my life was not how I wanted to spend a single moment of it. For the time being, everything else seemed far too important. Back in Philly a few days later, Nikitas and I headed down the street to watch the Little League game at the park. Deep in the outfield, I threw him pitches that he whacked at with his fat plastic bat. He watched the boys on the dirt diamond in the distance and said he was going to play too. When I get big, he asked me if I was going to play. When you get small. When I get small. I contemplated the innocent genius of this question. Of course, through eyes that don't know death, life must at some point begin again. Yes, I lied. When I get small. And for a moment, we existed in a field where time bends back on itself, and we grow younger after we've grown older. And we get to be here together forever. Thanks. So that was Victor, whose middle name is Alberto. And there's a part in the book about the naming of Victor. Victor is named after my mother-in-law, Victoria. And Alberto, the middle name is Alberto Pochettino, which had been my first choice for the first name. And it was going to be Victoria if it was a girl. And then when it was a boy, Lana changed her mind and said, "How about Victor?" And that seemed perfect. So we went with Victor Alberto. So thanks. Delighted to chat with you if you have any questions.
I just want to clarify, the heart, you're still with the 5 millimeter?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. So as Dr. Teratola said in that last meeting that we had looking at that image, he just sort of shook his head. And there wasn't even evidence of collateral veins, certainly not on the chest, because that's common. He described how patients with pacemakers often get sort of blockages because it's right in there, and then you see these other veins that sort of form around it, and that's the dynamic. But I don't have that, and you couldn't even see any collateral veins within the body. But he just said they have to be in there because that's the only scientific explanation for how you're getting sufficient blood to the heart, because that superior vena cava is the last, river or tributary into the heart.
Fascinating that the replacement acted the same way as the.
Amazing. Yeah. So, when I was first dealing with that narrowing, that's when I learned about the collateral vein idea. I had never heard of it. But the reason why I had gotten that message, there's nothing left that we could do, is because, this thing was growing and it wasn't going to stop growing. And there wasn't time for collateral veins to form, let's say, even if it was benign. And there would be these other veins that would compensate for that total closing up of the superior vena cava. The only difference was that later, I didn't have such a malignant thing growing. It was just the natural scarring. It was still the drama. There was still sort of the clock ticking, but now it was a much more kind of natural clock. And fortunately, it didn't close up, and he was ready to put a stent in there. Yeah. And just didn't get so uncomfortable that I insisted.
Is it ever an option to do that again? Or
now I feel so good that I wouldn't dare. So if the message was, let's not mess with what's not broken, that is all the more true now. I'm on Coumadin, I'm on anticoagulants. Some doctors have said, and we could scan, but it would only be just out of intellectual or, kind of curiosity to just see what it looks like in there. But some have speculated that maybe it is actually closed up at this point, and it's actually other collateral veins that are taking the blood to the heart. That maybe I don't even need to be on Coumadin. There's always that risk of a bleed. But nobody wants to be the doctor that says, yeah, let's try that. So I'm still on.
This is so rare. Your doctors haven't seen it. Are there support groups? Breast cancer, there's a million different organizations and Facebook pages and so forth. Do you find people?
It'll be interesting to see, in the response to the book, if it rings any bells, if I get any emails. I've gotten one message from an old friend that I grew up with in Lancaster and haven't spoken to in 35 years, that connected with me and said, my mother-in-law's sister or something, read it and was blown away because that's how her uncle, and I thought, okay, probably it's close, but maybe. And then she wrote like the exact language of like lymphoma in the superior vena cava. I was blown away, and died. That they, exactly as Schuster said, and they found it in autopsy. So I can't even imagine how if she or they ever heard about anything until they read my book.
Right.
Imagine their shock, let alone mine. I'm here to enjoy the anecdote of the connection with an old friend and the misfortune of that. But my buddy who's a doctor did research and used the whole computer system to try to do like, you'd think there would be this network of, you just look it up and there it is, the Google medical system. And he found 2 cases of just cancer in veins, let alone lymphoma in the chest wall. Like they had every reason to, just discount that possibility from the beginning. And the one was like from 1980s in Japan in a shoulder, and another was like in a leg in Brazil in the early 2000s. Those are the 2 cases that he found of lymphoma in the vein.
So isn't that these people that when it's found in autopsy, is it because they not seek medical treatment and it's like an X-ray first and they just die and then they do an autopsy to find out just what the cause of death was?
That's a great question. But my only speculating thought is what Dr. Schuster says in that video, which was not only was it extraordinary because it was lymphoma in a vein, but that it was localized, right? So maybe those other people had spread and there were other reasons for how it ended up being fatal, whereas mine was only there. So maybe in these other cases, they weren't only in that one spot and they found it, then, oh, look, it's over here too, in the vein.
If you didn't have symptoms though, you could have been that person. If you had no
Right.
symptoms, they never would have,
Right.
you have no reason to, because it's like a blessing.
I suppose. I mean, I think the thing that was threatening to kill me was the total blockage of blood flow to the heart as opposed to lymphoma killing me. Right. So, but yeah. No, not since the 5-year. I went just kind of routinely as cancer patients do, 6 months, every 6 months for the, and then through 5 years, once a year. And then after that, it's in that last epilogue where, my oncologist and I sort of laugh and he says, yep, I've got as good a chance as you do at this point, where statistically equals. Yeah.
What are some of the things that you did to keep yourself motivated or keep yourself on from just thinking about what does the end look for me?
Yeah. I think in the most twisted way, the best thing that ever happened was that the first thing anybody ever said to me was the worst thing you ever want to hear, which is, we don't know what this is, it could be fatal. Just, I think my whole soul just went right to this place that it never went before and just started doing its work and kind of adapting to that possibility. And I suppose somewhere in there was this idea of, if that's true, how do I want to be? You feel anger, you feel fear, you feel sorrow, and it's not like I suppressed it. I lived those things. There were explosive moments of all of those emotions. And then you come back, and think, okay, again, let's say it's 2 weeks. Do you want to be in a frothy rage for 2 weeks if this is it?
Right. So there's a lot of different emotions that you had to deal with at the time, and you just one day was a good day, maybe the next day wasn't. So you're just going through a process and your family understood.
Absolutely.
Exactly what you were going through.
Yeah. And again, I mean, I'm happy to say that it was not quite that ratio. It was more, maybe it was 90-10.
Okay.
That you'd have those moments of devastating sorrow or fear or anger, frustration. I guess it wasn't anger. Anger, you direct it at something. There was nothing to direct it to. It was so abstract. It was mostly just kind of fear and anxiety, and terrible sadness at the thought that this could be it, but then immediately the thing you recognize that you're sad because you love so much. And so it's right there, the alternative, the universe, God is providing you with the solution to that fear and to that sorrow. Live this moment. You're alive. You're breathing.
Right.
In a way, it goes right back to the moment when I called my father and he said, just breathe. And there was my dad on the other end of the line, just kind of getting it. And that ended up being a kind of metaphor and mantra, like right up to this moment, in my life, you know, of
Just breathe.
you're here now. Like there were critical moments as the story went on, as you just heard, you know, that you can imagine, where like, oh my God, again, like, and it would seem worse because it was the 10th ordeal or another thing. It was just this relentless battery of bad news. But, you know, could have been worse. I could not be here right now getting this lymphoma diagnosis, or I could not be here at all, you know, to see that this darn thing is narrowing again. And now there's this, okay? I remember the first visit that I got from the psychiatrist there. And I think it was routine. It wasn't because they saw this guy and said, we gotta get this guy. You know, this is this guy, you know, situation. And I got a visit from a psychiatrist, and he sort of taught me some mantra and some meditation skills. And we kind of went through this whole kind of meditation of imagine these worst case scenarios, but you're okay. And right now, and what if this happens? You're okay. You're going to call me and I'll be here, or your doctor's going to be here, and you know, you'll get back here and you're okay. Like it just kept coming back to the moment. In this moment, you're okay. So, you know, that's a great reminder in any situation in life, let alone, you know, one that's critical where you feel like your life is at stake. But it's a great way to kind of try to continually, and it's a work in progress, but sort of control your reaction to any kind of negative stimulation in your life, like just a moment, and then your response even a second after that check is always better than your initial spontaneous response.
Thank you for sharing.
Yeah.
Could you tell me about the narrative medicine workshop at Columbia?
Yeah, I think I had started a draft and I was well into it, and went to the writers conference that I go to every year, the AWP, the American Writers Association, blah, blah, blah. And Rita Sharon, the doctor who runs the Columbia program there, who's kind of the founder of narrative medicine, which is a concept I had never even heard of. I saw it in the catalog of all the things that you could go and see, and there was this panel, and I was knocked out. And it turns out she has a whole department at Columbia. And then I learned that this is a thing that's spreading throughout the whole country, that medical schools are incorporating narrative medicine into the education of their medical students. I mean, the gist of it is almost as simple as just kind of having English class in med school. And they read a piece of literature and they talk about the characters and they talk about, you know, the value of storytelling. And it's not just for the patient, it's also for the doctor, you know, that the doctor is often not given an opportunity to express him or herself and their trials. I've had the pleasure of visiting, for example, I visited the narrative medicine group at CHOP and at Penn, and these great groups of maybe 12 or 18 people, and they do their writing. They might have a poem, they share it. It's just like a writer's workshop, and they're rooted in their field, and it's beautiful. It was nice to be able to share with them, and that's the energy of it. It's kind of philosophical, but you know, and therapeutic. But then the idea is like, now take that into the space where you're treating the patient and listen to their story, because you don't know what you don't know. You know, you've got your training and you've got your learning, but this patient has a story to tell, and you might pick up something that you wouldn't have seen, you know, in the checkbox list or whatever the traditional way of assessing a patient is.
You know, some of my best teachers at CHOP when I was a resident said, if you listen to the patient, you really listen, you ask the right questions and listen, they'll tell you what's wrong.
Right. Right.
Sure.
Yeah, Terratola in that one, you know, clip in the video, he's like, you know, you and me, Jim, it's just, we're talking now. You need to tell me. And there was incredible trust there where he was taking taking the messages from me, and that I trusted that when he said, like, I will be here for you if you need me, but we want to hold out if we can. And amazing intimate relationship with several of those doctors, not just with him. Dr. Miller, the guy who let me down into the basement to sit with
His
him.
father was one of my
It's unbelievable.
Father
Yeah.
Miller, sure.
Amazing guy. When I left the room that day and I said, hey, by the way, and this is just after I had been told, there's nothing left that we can do. And he let me down in there. And I said, how many times have you sat with a patient like this? And he says, you're it, my man. So it was royal treatment. Yeah. And I needed to be there for them to make the next assessment and step, because in the moment was when they looked at each other and said, this might be for Pochettino, and for me to have witnessed that helped me to prepare for, his visit and his proposal and my welcoming of that kind of Hail Mary plan.
Do they know what caused the lymphoma?
I don't think so.
Hmm.
I've never, for those couple of years where I was going to Dr. Schuster regularly, I don't remember a time when he wouldn't look over at that screen and shake his head as if it were the first time and say, never seen anything like this before. And he'd look at me and say, 40 years I've been doing this. Never seen anything like this before. So not exactly an answer to the question. I don't know how you'd answer that question if it was the common presentation of lymphoma and why it suddenly appears in a patient, but certainly not in the way that it presented in me. But it doesn't run in my family. There's no history of cancer in my family. So when my little boy, Victor, asked me, like, what happened? You got dirt in there? What did you say? Maybe at some point I described it in some way, or that was the language he kind of took from it. I sympathize with him, because if that's the explanation, he must be thinking, like, I got to make sure I don't get that, in my body. How'd that happen to you? Yeah, right. Yeah. Use that leverage. That's some cruel parent tactics there. You don't want dirt.
I was actually going to ask you about that. You were a brand new parent when this all started.
Yeah.
So you have it just, the day-to-day craziness and chaos of being a parent, and at the same time, I bet you have a completely different outlook, because I don't even know how to explain this, because you have found peace and you found calm at the lowest point that you could have been. Yet you're not going to reject this to your children. So I'm curious, if you don't know parenting any other way. You don't know parenting the way we know it, because a lot of us haven't had the life-threatening experience. So do you feel that you're teaching them this level of being present and living in the moment more than you think you would have before, like if this had not happened?
Oh, definitely, relatively speaking. My oldest son knows I meditate, and sometimes when he can't go to sleep at night, in fact, several times a week, he'll come and grab me and say, Daddy, can we do a meditation? And it's a nice way to go to sleep, and I'll come in there and just sit with him. It's always a yes. I never say no to, can we have a catch? I drop everything for moments like that. It's hard for me to know, but I can certainly imagine. I would say not today or not now or whatever. But it has to be impossible for me, for whatever reason, to do those things when they want to be with me. And I always want to be with them. So yeah, and those pictures, that was that intense connection that I felt with them, which makes me far from a perfect parent and anything but always calm and cool. But as is the case in every aspect of my life, and since you put it in those terms, relatively speaking, I know that because of, from my experience and this practice, that I catch myself. And so I get back on track faster. You know, I recognize when I don't like my reactions. I recognize quickly when I don't like how I'm being, because I know how I want to be. And so I'm just much more, it's an understatement. I'm always aware, or I get aware really fast when I'm off track, to get back on track and try to make that not just this thing that I do for 10 minutes a day, but to try to be in that state of mind. And so, you know, in a way, I feel like I'm more aware of my constant failing. But before, I wouldn't have even been thinking in those terms. I would have just been unconsciously going about my life and, you know, having to be reminded by my wife and everybody else, like, you know, calm down or whatever. We get messages from others, at least if we're awake to that. But yeah, I've got my own kind of internal mechanisms that are reminding me.
You're an incredibly skillful writer.
Thanks.
In general. I don't say that to everybody, obviously, I'm a poster. And so does this translate into fiction for you? Like, has that occurred to you, like, to write fiction based on your experience?
When I first started writing this, my fiction writer friends were telling me, yeah, you know, you got great stuff for a novel. And I was open to the possibility of this becoming whatever it might become. But it started with, you know, just trying to get the clinical story down. I wasn't even thinking I was writing something that was going to be nonfiction or a book for an audience or anything. It's just kind of like, I need this. And it took a while, as that last part is like, it wasn't something even a year out that I was interested. I was still in this mindset of, you know, I just can't sit and do these other things for an extended period of time. There were other things that I preferred doing. But when I got around to it, that was my approach. Sooner or later, you know, to kind of flip the question, my background or my previous experience as a fiction writer started to shape how I would approach this thing and try to make a book out of it in chapters. And so, but it was a long process because it was the first nonfiction I'd ever written. I'd never thought about writing nonfiction. I had written short stories, a novel, a couple of unpublished novels, and then that was this experience. And this was inevitably something that would have to be my next book or thing that I would write. And it would find its way. And in an earlier final version, this book was another 100 pages long. And, you know, I'm sure I'm not the first writer, and innumerable writers who are so glad that the earlier version didn't get published, because over the years with the feedback I was getting, it was just a constant kind of whittling it away, you know, down to its essence. And as I got more and more emotional distance from it, I could see it more, you know, as a work of art, and the choices that you make as a fiction writer when it's not so personal to you. And, you know, early on, like, everything made the cut. It was relevant. Oh, I can't cut that scene. That was such a great scene and important, and it happened. And then I could let go of these things. And I was cutting whole chapters. And in the final go around where I really decided I have a vision now for how I want this thing to be. And it was just going to be elemental. Every chapter was going to have its purpose. Every scene, I wanted nothing to be repetitive or redundant. And so I was doing a whole lot of cutting. And that came from that fiction background. The next thing I wrote after this was another memoir. I wasn't expecting to do that either, but I had a good time writing this. And I wanted to write about my teaching life. And I kind of approached the next thing in the same way, kind of open to whatever it might become. And so I decided to keep a log for a year, and kind of a daily log of a year in the life of being a teacher. And soon I started writing about being a dad to these little guys and how it kind of compared to teaching the 18-year-olds that I was teaching in school every day. And I was just kind of gathering material. But before you knew it, I started to see how this thing could be a book in its own way without fictionalizing it. And so that book's coming out next March. It's called Your Story Starts Here. And it's about a year in a life of being a teacher and a dad. And it was the first year of the Trump administration, and there were all sorts of interesting things going on in the world. And it was just the perfect context, and no reason to change it. But
I mean, I think this is one that was destined to be.
yeah,
It's just beautiful.
thank you so much.
Thank
Thank
Yeah.
you.
Go ahead.
No.
Thanks for sharing your story. You can get more than just reading it. So now looking forward to reading it.
Thank you.
and See what you had your team, obviously doctors, psychiatrists, everyone, friends, family, your children, your wife, your parents, you mentioned a couple times. Did they have a team? How were they dealing with this?
That's a great question. I mean, I had tremendous friends and I had tremendous, support with my family. And I think that they were, supportive within their circle. I know that my friends had their little circle, that they were always talking to each other about me and being in touch with me when they could be. They were supportive to each other, and my family in the same way. That said, it's family and it's imperfect, and there are moments in the story I won't get into right now where those bonds are challenged and it's just hard. But in the end, we're intact. And one of the things I really love to hear in the early days of the book coming out, again from old friends that sort of shoot me an email and say, "I just finished your book," and one friend who lives in Australia right now, was just so thankful that I didn't, sugarcoat things and try to make it just seem all, perfect and shiny, happy people story and perfect family. Like there's stuff in there. But the other side of that, or I think it complements that feedback, was another teacher colleague of mine who said something like, everybody just keeps showing up. Like it's rough and it gets ugly sometimes, but everyone shows up. And that's true. It doesn't always have to be, a hallmark moment, but in a way it's more encouraging and more gritty and real when you go through those rough things together and you still wake up the next day and you're hugging each other and you're right back at it. And so I know, there's that trust and love, you're going to get through the rough parts together. And I think my family had that support when I wasn't looking, when I didn't see it going on. But I know my wife had a lot of hard times to get through and felt lonely when I wasn't there to be with her. It's nobody else's fault. It's just, a lot of times a lonely experience to get through. And writing this book helped me, again, back to like writing a novel, trying to imagine like, how am I going to write this scene or this character? And it would force me to think like, oh my God, maybe only because I was trying to write how would she have been thinking in that scene. Jesus. And I was continually reminded or forced to imagine, in a way that I wouldn't have if I weren't trying to write the story, what she must have been going through. And I could say the same for my mother and various friends and family members, but especially for Vana. And so I have great admiration and gratitude for what she pulled off. And I didn't mention earlier, and this is in the book, but not to go on. I had a moment where I was pausing, I forgot my thought, but I just remembered, speaking of Vana and the ordeal that she went through. My son, when he was 6 years old, was diagnosed with ITP. I used to be able to pronounce this 20-syllable medical term, but he was losing his white blood cells, the white blood platelets, right? Yeah. And his numbers were dropping to sort of simplify the whole thing. And Vana, he had to wear the helmet because he was at risk of bruising and so on. That whole summer, I was with him every second. He was always wearing this helmet. The numbers dropped to a point after which, once you kind of infuse the patient with the white blood cells, the platelets that they need, that you have basically sort of set the precedent for the rest of their life. Correct me if I'm wrong. This is now their condition. So what you try to hope to do is just protect them from having a bleed, but the only thing that's going to correct it is that the body corrects itself, right? But down when you get to like 7, it should be at 400. CHOP said, we're going to give you another couple of days, but if this doesn't turn around, we got to do the infusion. And this is going to be it for him for life. You're going to have regular platelet infusions, and this will be his condition. And it was a traumatizing 6 months. She and I were taking off every other day from work to be at home with him because the daycare couldn't have him. Somebody had to be with him. We had good employers that were helping us during this time, but summer came and I was off, so I could be with him every single day. The 4-day period where I was in the hospital, he had dropped to 7. The next day, by chance, I got a phone call from CHOP. They had 2 cell phone numbers. They could have called Vanna or they could have called me. And they called me and they said, good news. Your kid's numbers just shot up to like 78. And the next day after that, it was 134. But that's what Vanna was going through. We were watching our kids' platelet numbers drop to the point where he was about to become a lifelong ITP, platelet infusion patient. In the same 48-hour period where that initial presentation happened to me, and I was on my seeming deathbed, just when he took a turn for the better. But I received that call, and I a picture of that amazing corner room I had, staring out at the city. And I was getting a call from next door. This is who? Dr. So-and-so. I mean, I was in a completely different universe, and hearing this news, like, oh, my son's numbers, I almost forgot. And I just lost it, like tears of joy of this good news to hear of him. But again, she was out there having a whole other experience. Yeah. Thanks. Thanks, everybody. Thank you so much.
That's great.
Thank you. Absolutely. I'll have a seat. Sure. Thank you.
Great. Yay.